The cell was never just a space of confinement. It was a sentence carved into stone, a silent predator that consumed both body and spirit. Imagine being thrust into a narrow chamber where the walls seemed to close in, damp with centuries of moisture, exhaling a stench of mold and rot. The air was heavy, not simply because it was scarce, but because it carried the weight of despair left behind by countless souls who had withered within those same walls. One could hear water dripping endlessly from the ceiling, like a clock without hands, reminding the captive that time no longer belonged to him. There was rarely a bed, often just a slab of cold stone or a pile of straw already blackened with filth. Rats scurried freely, their tiny claws scratching the silence as they gnawed on scraps. To the prisoner, these vermin were both torment and companions. Some learned to whisper to them at night, seeking a twisted kind of comfort, while others feared waking to find their toes bitten bloody. Insects nested in every corner, and the prisoner's flesh soon bore the scars of endless bites. The dampness made clothes cling to the skin, while sores festered and refused to heal. The medieval dungeon was not designed to simply hold a body. It was designed to unmake a man. The darkness was absolute. Hours, days, weeks blended into one another because no ray of sunlight could seep through the iron bars. In such silence, the mind became treacherous. Shapes formed in the shadows, voices rose from the stones, and the prisoner could no longer distinguish reality from hallucination. Some began scratching marks into the walls, desperate to measure time, but when the walls filled with hundreds of lines, hope turned to mockery. The chains were not always meant for security. Often they were meant to remind. Shackles dug into the ankles, cold iron gnawed the wrists, and the clanking echoed with every small movement. The pain was constant, not sharp, but grinding, like the slow erosion of the self. Many men who once stood proudly on the battlefield ended up crawling in their cells, reduced to nothing but creatures dragging chains behind them. And in that humiliation lay the true punishment. The smell was another form of torture. Without sanitation, the cell reeked of excrement, of sweat baked into skin, of blood dried on the floor. It was not unusual for multiple prisoners to be thrown together into a single chamber, forced to live amid filth. When one fell ill, the others breathed in his fever, coughed with his lungs, and knew that disease was never more than a breath away. When one died, the body might remain for days before being dragged away, serving as a reminder of what awaited the living. Yet, for all its cruelty, the cell was not silent. The screams of those being tortured elsewhere in the dungeon bled through the walls, punctuated by the ringing of metal or the guttural orders of guards. For some, those cries were proof that they were not alone. For others, they were a chilling forecast of what was coming. Each sound pressed itself into memory, echoing endlessly, replaying even in moments of rare quiet. Survival in such a place was not about strength of body, but resilience of spirit. Some captives sang under their breath to keep themselves tethered to sanity. Others recited prayers until the words lost meaning, and some recounted their past lives, feasts, fields, lovers, only to feel them slipping further away with every repetition. The cell devoured memory just as it devoured flesh. Men who entered as warriors, merchants, or nobles emerged as hollow husks, no longer certain of their own names. There were moments when the cell itself seemed to test the prisoner, to probe the limits of his humanity. Hunger and thirst carved away at reason. When the guards slid a bowl of foul water through the bars, it was consumed greedily despite the taste of rust and sewage. When moldy bread appeared, it was a feast. And yet, even in those moments of desperate relief, the prisoner knew he was being toyed with. His suffering was not an accident, it was the design. The cell was more than walls, chains, and darkness. It was a weapon, sharper than a sword and more enduring than any arrow. It worked slowly, invisibly, cutting deeper than steel. And once a man was swallowed by it, he was never truly free again, even if the door one day opened. Because the cell left marks not only on the skin, but on the soul itself. Food was not nourishment in the dungeons of the Middle Ages. It was humiliation served in wooden bowls and broken clay pots, a reminder that survival was not meant to be comfortable, but to stretch misery as long as possible. The meals were few, sometimes once a day, sometimes less, and they were always designed to keep a man alive without giving him strength. Thin broth floated with a few grains of barley, or at best, the oily skin of some forgotten animal. Prisoners would hunch over it as if it were gold, licking every drop, knowing that the next taste of sustenance might come only after endless hours of hunger gnawing at their insides. Bread was the most common offering, yet it was bread in name only, hard as stone, covered with mold, infested with worms. Men with broken teeth from battles or beatings tried to soften it in the putrid water they were given, but even then it scraped their throats on the way down. There are records of prisoners breaking that bread against the wall and watching insects crawl out, only to consume it anyway. Hunger had no dignity, and in those cells, a worm was not seen as corruption, but as extra protein. Sometimes meat appeared, though it was less gift than punishment. Bones stripped from the kitchens of their captors, blackened scraps of organs no one else would eat, or the flesh of animals long past decay. In colder months, the meat was tough and rancid. In warmer months, it swarmed with maggots. The guards knew this, and some even mocked the prisoners by chewing their own fresh meals in front of them before tossing in the rot that no dog outside the castle would touch. Yet the captives fought over it, tearing its sinew with fingers and teeth reduced to scavengers in their chains. Starvation carved itself slowly into the body. Cheeks sank, eyes hollowed, ribs jutted against skin, and fingers trembled with weakness. But worse than the physical wasting was the constant obsession with food. Men dreamt of banquets they once attended, of roasted boars and steaming bread, of sweet wine and ripe fruit. They awoke to find only slime at the bottom of a bowl, and that contrast was enough to crush the will. There are stories of prisoners licking the damp walls for moisture, or chewing leather straps from their own shoes just to silence the roar of their stomachs. The cruelest part was that hunger made enemies out of brothers. When one man guarded his portion too fiercely, others conspired to steal it. Alliances broke down over a crust of bread. In cells where many were thrown together, fights erupted. Not for escape or honor, but for a handful of boiled grains floating in a dirty broth. Some prisoners learned to hoard tiny crumbs, hiding them beneath straw, rationing them as if they were treasure. Others simply gave up, pushing bowls away and letting their hunger consume them faster, as if death by starvation promised a quicker end than waiting for disease or torture. Hunger also blurred the lines between man and beast. Prisoners watched rats crawl into the cell and pounced on them with bare hands. They tore fur from flesh with teeth, consuming raw meat in the shadows. Chroniclers described noblemen, once dressed in silk and armor, reduced to chewing on rodents while their jailers laughed. That degradation was not accidental. It was part of the punishment. The captor wanted not just the body, but the soul of his prisoner to rot. And then there was thirst, an agony sharper than hunger. The water brought into the dungeon was often drawn from the filthiest wells, tasting of rust, mud, and human waste. It came in small amounts, never enough. Men drank their own urine in desperation, or scooped puddles from the floor after rain seeped through the stones. The lips cracked, the tongue swelled, and the mind slipped into delirium. Depriving a prisoner of clean water was a weapon as lethal as any sword, but the cruelty of prison rations carried an irony. Captors understood that death was not the goal. A prisoner dead from hunger or thirst was useless, whether as a source of ransom, information, or political leverage. So they fed them just enough to keep them alive, just enough to prolong the torment. It was a science of suffering, too little to thrive, too much to die, and within that narrow balance, life itself became unbearable. The memory of food, more than its absence, tortured the prisoners the most. To think of roasted lamb dripping with fat, or bread still warm from the oven, or the sweetness of honey across the tongue, was to suffer twice, once in hunger and once in memory. This slow erosion of the mind through longing prepared the captive for further punishments, making him pliable, easier to break. Hunger became the invisible whip, striking without pause, leaving scars deeper than lash marks. And just when a prisoner thought he could endure no more, when his body hung by threads of sinew and spirit, the guards introduced a new cruelty, one not of the stomach, but of the flesh itself. Hunger weakened the man, but daily beatings reminded him that his suffering was far from complete. The cell, the food, the thirst were only the beginning, and what awaited him was far darker. Punishment in the medieval dungeon was not a passing event. It was a rhythm, a daily ritual designed to strip away dignity piece by piece until nothing remained of the man who first entered the cell. Hunger had already softened the spirit, thirst had weakened the body, but punishment was the hammer that reshaped the prisoner into something unrecognizable. It was not enough to hold him captive. He had to be broken, humiliated, made to understand that resistance was a dream that no longer belonged to him. Whips were among the most common tools. Strips of leather, often tipped with bits of metal or bone, lashed across the back until skin split and blood mingled with sweat. The whistling of the whip in the air was often worse than the strike itself, because the sound carried through the entire dungeon. Every prisoner knew that when the echoing crack came, another body was learning what awaited them tomorrow. Some were beaten until they collapsed, others until they could no longer scream, because silence was seen as submission. Guards were skilled in the art of stopping just before death, dragging a man back to his cell so he could rot slowly, wounds festering in the filth. But not all punishments were so direct. Sometimes the cruelty was designed to play with the mind. Prisoners were forced to kneel on shards of stone for hours, their knees bleeding into the dirt. Others were hung by the wrists, their toes barely touching the ground, muscles tearing from the strain as time stretched unbearably. There was no need for execution when exhaustion itself could feel like death. Men who had once fought with swords and armor now begged for mercy because of ropes and chains. Water was another weapon, not the lack of it this time, but its presence. Prisoners were sometimes strapped to boards and had their mouths forced open as water was poured relentlessly down their throats, choking them until their lungs screamed for air. Centuries later, this same method would earn the name waterboarding. But in the dungeons of the Middle Ages, it was already known as a way to simulate drowning without spilling blood. The prisoner would cough and thrash, sure that death had arrived, only for the guards to stop, laugh, and start again. And then there was fire. Torches were not only sources of light, they were instruments of terror. Captives had flames held close to their skin until blisters rose, or irons heated in the fire were pressed against their flesh. The smell of burning skin filled the dungeon, a smell so unforgettable that survivors carried it in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. There are chronicles of men who confessed to crimes they had never committed just to escape the hiss of the iron. Punishment was not always about pain. Sometimes it was about humiliation. A knight stripped of his armor was paraded in rags before the guards, mocked and spat on. Some were forced to clean the filth of the dungeon with their bare hands, or made to crawl on all fours while soldiers jeered. The loss of honor was a wound that cut deeper than whips. In a society built on reputation, a man reduced to an object of ridicule often wished he had died on the battlefield instead. Yet punishment was not random. It was calculated. Guards alternated between cruelty and small mercies, sometimes giving water after a beating, sometimes leaving a wound untreated. This unpredictability broke the mind even faster than steady pain. Prisoners could never know whether the next day would bring a crust of bread or the iron brand. That uncertainty gnawed at sanity, turning every creak of the dungeon door into a moment of dread. Some punishments went beyond the prisoner himself. If a captive refused to speak, his cellmates might be punished in his place, beaten before his eyes. The guilt of watching another suffer because of one's silence was a weapon more powerful than any whip. Bonds of friendship and loyalty shattered under such weight, because eventually a man would say anything, betray anyone, just to end the torment of others. Still, the body is stubborn. Even when bruised, burned, and bleeding, it clings to life. And so the captors sought other ways to weaken their prisoners. They exploited the filth of the dungeon itself. Wounds left untreated became infected, insects burrowed into flesh, and disease spread like wildfire. Punishment and sickness merged into one long agony. To be struck by a guard was painful, but to watch a wound rot slowly was worse. It was punishment delivered not by man, but by time. The daily beatings, the endless humiliations, the manipulation of both pain and hope, all of these served one purpose: to reduce the prisoner to nothing more than a shadow of himself. A man could endure hunger, he could endure thirst, but punishment aimed for something deeper. It aimed for the soul. Once the soul was broken, escape was no longer needed. The prisoner would remain captive even if the door was left open. And yet, within the darkness of the dungeon, amid whips, fire, and chains, another enemy lurked, one that the prisoners could not see but felt every day. It was not the blow of the guard, nor the bite of hunger, but the slow, creeping invasion of disease, which killed more captives than sword or rope ever could. Disease was the silent executioner of the medieval dungeon. It did not come with the clang of chains or the crack of a whip. It came quietly, creeping into lungs, festering in wounds, spreading from skin to skin in the suffocating darkness. Where punishment broke the body, disease finished what the guards began, devouring men slowly until their cells became nothing more than tombs. In truth, more prisoners died from illness than from torture, and those deaths were rarely swift. They dragged on for weeks, every cough, every fever, every infected sore a reminder that survival was slipping away grain by grain. The air itself was poison. With no circulation, the dungeon became a breeding ground for contagion. The moisture in the stones, the stagnant puddles on the floor, and the stench of waste turned each breath into a risk. Respiratory diseases spread with frightening speed. Tuberculosis, called the consumption by some, wasted men into skeletons who coughed blood into the straw beneath them. Pneumonia struck without mercy, turning breaths into wheezes that grew weaker until silence claimed them. The sound of hacking coughs echoed through corridors as a grim chorus, each one a prophecy of death. Skin diseases flourished in the filth. Without clean clothes or water, rashes and boils became common. Scabies burrowed under the skin, covering bodies with relentless itching that left flesh raw from scratching. Ulcers grew around shackles where iron cut into flesh, and those open wounds became gateways for infection. Gangrene followed, blackening limbs until the smell of rot filled the air. Sometimes the guards would mock a prisoner whose flesh had turned dark, calling him a corpse that still walks. Few lasted long after such words. Then there was dysentery, perhaps the most merciless of all. With contaminated food and foul water, prisoners were struck by unstoppable diarrhea, dehydrating until their bodies shrank into husks. The filth spread quickly in shared cells, one man's sickness becoming everyone's curse. Chroniclers describe dungeons where straw was soaked in waste, where the smell of human decay was so strong that even guards gagged as they opened the doors. Prisoners too weak to move lay in their own filth, and those still alive envied the dead. The spread of plague was not uncommon either. The same rats that prisoners hunted for food also carried fleas that brought the Black Death. In times of epidemic, dungeons became death traps. There are accounts of entire groups of captives wiped out within days, their bodies piled in corners while survivors clung to life, waiting for the same fate. The guards rarely risked entering such places, throwing scraps through the bars and letting disease decide who lived and who perished. But disease was not just a physical battle, it was psychological torment. Watching a cellmate cough blood or scream as fever consumed him planted fear in the hearts of the others. They knew they were breathing the same foul air, drinking the same tainted water. They knew it was only a matter of time. Hope withered as quickly as flesh. In some cells, the healthy turned on the sick, pushing them aside, refusing to share space or food, treating them as though they were already dead. Others clung to their dying companions, whispering prayers over them, desperate for any shred of humanity in a place designed to erase it. The cruelty of disease was amplified by neglect. There were no healers for prisoners, no bandages, no herbs, no remedies, not even the simplest care. A fever that might have been cured in a warm home was a death sentence in the cold dungeon. Even minor injuries became lethal. A scrape from a chain, a rat bite, a cut from a stone, each could turn septic and spread rot through the body. The dungeon turned small wounds into killers, and there was no escape. And yet, disease served the captors. They understood that the threat of illness could break a prisoner's resolve more efficiently than any instrument of torture. Why waste energy on endless beatings when sickness would do the work for them? Some even believed it was divine justice, that prisoners deserved to waste away, that the dungeon was God's tool to cleanse society of traitors and enemies. For the jailers, it was convenient. For the prisoners, it was another layer of despair. But what disease could not kill outright, it weakened. Men who survived infection rarely came out whole. They carried scars, chronic coughs, blindness, or missing limbs. They were shells of their former selves, limping, trembling, unable to return to the lives they once had. Even freedom could not heal them fully. The dungeon marked them, not just in the body, but in the way they moved, in the fear that lingered in their eyes. In the end, disease was the dungeon's most loyal servant. It worked silently, endlessly, never tiring, never stopping. It erased names, faces, and voices, reducing men to anonymous corpses carried out under the cover of night. Those who lived long enough to see others die knew that death was not the only fate awaiting them. Worse than death was the endless waiting, the false hope of ransom or release that never came, while the body grew weaker each day, suspended in a cruel limbo. And so, as the coughs echoed through the walls and the smell of rot thickened in the air, prisoners realized that survival was not just about enduring chains, hunger, and disease. It was about enduring time itself. Because the dungeon was not built to kill swiftly. It was built to make men wait, to stretch their agony until rescue or death arrived. And for most, rescue never did. Waiting was its own form of torment in the medieval dungeon. Unlike the whip, the iron, or the hunger, it did not break the body immediately. It hollowed the spirit over time. Captives sat in the darkness with nothing but their thoughts, clinging to the fragile thread of hope that someone, somewhere, would pay the price of their freedom. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Hope, once fierce, eroded like stone beneath dripping water, until even the strongest hearts began to crumble. For many prisoners, ransom was not just a possibility, it was the only lifeline. Nobles and knights were especially vulnerable to this cruel system, because their lives had value to enemies who knew families or lords might pay for their release. A knight captured on the battlefield could expect negotiations, letters sent across kingdoms, promises whispered in candlelit chambers. But in the dungeon, he had no control over any of it. Every creak of the door could mean news of ransom, or another day of silence. The cruelty of waiting lay in its uncertainty. Some men truly were valuable, their names powerful enough to spark bargaining, but others, especially common soldiers or peasants, were kept waiting for rescues that would never come. Families without wealth could not pay. Lords often ignored their lesser men, seeing them as expendable. And so prisoners sat, clinging to rumors, imagining coins being counted in distant castles, when, in reality, no one outside the dungeon walls even spoke their names. Negotiations, when they did happen, were painfully slow. Messengers took weeks to travel across kingdoms, and replies came just as slowly. Meanwhile, the prisoner rotted. Imagine sitting in the damp dark, knowing that somewhere far away men argued about your worth like livestock at a market. Was he worth 20 silver coins, or 30? Was his freedom worth 1 horse, or 2? The prisoner's body weakened, his sanity cracked, while strangers debated the price of his life. Sometimes ransom never arrived, not because families refused, but because captors made demands so outrageous they could never be met. There are records of lords demanding entire estates, whole villages, or impossible sums of gold. Such demands were not made to secure freedom. They were made to prolong captivity. For the prisoner, hearing of such negotiations was worse than silence. It meant that freedom dangled just out of reach, always close, but never attainable. The waiting corroded trust as well. Prisoners who once believed their kin would never abandon them began to doubt. Did their families still care? Did their wives remarry? Did their lords decide it was cheaper to let them die? Doubt gnawed harder than hunger. Some men cursed their own bloodlines in rage, swearing that if they ever escaped, they would take vengeance not on their captors, but on those who failed to rescue them. Others sank into quiet despair, whispering their loved ones' names in the darkness until the syllables lost all meaning. And yet, in rare cases, a ransom was paid. The door opened, a prisoner was led into the light, and freedom seemed real again. But those moments brought bitterness too. To the ones left behind, watching a cellmate leave was not only a reminder that freedom was possible, it was also a knife twisting in the gut. Why him and not me? Why was his life worth more than mine? Envy and resentment poisoned the cells, and bonds of brotherhood cracked under the strain of unequal hope. Worse still were the cruel tricks of the guards. Some would whisper that ransom money had arrived, only to laugh when the prisoner believed it. Others promised release soon, stretching that lie for weeks, feeding off the hope and despair of men who no longer knew what to believe. Hope became a weapon sharper than iron because it prolonged suffering more effectively than pain. Time itself became the enemy. Without clocks or calendars, prisoners marked days with scratches on stone until the walls were filled with desperate tallies. But when the marks numbered in the hundreds, even that practice felt pointless. What did it matter if he had been captive 300 days or 3,000? Time lost all meaning except as a reminder of everything slipping away, the seasons not seen, the meals not shared, the faces not touched. Waiting became a slow form of death, one that left the body breathing but the spirit buried. The cruelest truth was that many prisoners never knew why their rescue never came. Perhaps the ransom was refused. Perhaps the messenger never arrived. Perhaps their family lacked the means. In some cases, the captors themselves lied, pocketing money while keeping the prisoner locked away, laughing as he continued to wait for a freedom that had already been bought. The dungeon was a world of shadows where truth rarely reached, and so waiting became not just unbearable but senseless. And when waiting stretched too long, the body itself gave up. Men wasted away not only from hunger or sickness, but from the simple exhaustion of hope. They stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped looking at the door when it opened. The will to live, once fierce, drained like water from a cracked vessel. Death in those cases was not violent. It was quiet, almost gentle, as though the prisoner simply decided one morning not to wake. But even for those who endured, waiting left scars. When the chains were finally removed and the gates opened, the prisoner carried more than weakened muscles and scarred flesh. He carried the memory of endless days where each moment was a question with no answer. And while some ransomed men walked into the sun again, many others never did. They remained in the darkness, waiting still, because freedom was a gift reserved for the few, not the many. And just when prisoners thought they had endured every cruelty, the hunger, the disease, the punishments, and the false hope, another torment revealed itself. It was not one inflicted by chains or coins, but by the very silence of the dungeon itself. For in those endless hours, the greatest weapon against a prisoner was isolation, the crushing loneliness that turned even strong minds into fragile glass. Loneliness in a medieval dungeon was not silence. It was a roar that grew louder each day. When the body is chained and the stomach hollowed by hunger, there still remains one fragile refuge, the mind. But in those stone cells, even the mind was attacked. The prisoner found himself trapped not only by walls, but by his own thoughts, spinning endlessly with nowhere to land. Isolation was not an accident. It was deliberate. Some cells were designed to hold a single captive, narrow enough that he could not stretch his arms fully, with a door that opened rarely. In that crushing solitude, a man's sense of self began to unravel, as though the dungeon itself was swallowing his identity piece by piece. At first, the loneliness was a quiet ache. A knight accustomed to banquets and laughter, or a farmer used to the chatter of the fields, might find the silence unsettling but bearable. But as days blurred into nights, the absence of voices became unbearable. Some prisoners shouted into the void, desperate to hear an echo that proved they were not already ghosts. Others began talking to rats, to cracks in the walls, to the sound of dripping water, inventing conversations to remind themselves that words still existed. The human mind, deprived of connection, created phantoms. Many swore they heard footsteps outside, whispers calling their names, or the voices of loved ones who had long since given up hope. This was not madness born of weakness, it was a survival instinct. Studies centuries later would show that the brain craves interaction as desperately as it craves food or water. Without it, the mind invents substitutes. In the dungeon, this meant hallucinations, visions of light in the dark, faces in the stone, songs that never existed. A prisoner might swear he saw his wife's figure in the shadows, or heard his child's laughter carried through the air. And when those visions vanished, despair sank deeper because reality returned harsher than before. Some men clung to rituals to fight the emptiness. They carved patterns into the stone, sang hymns, recited prayers, or repeated the names of their family like talismans against insanity. Others scratched drawings of animals, swords, or crosses, desperate to leave some proof that they had once been alive. But even rituals could not stop the crushing tide of silence. The lack of human touch, The absence of even a shared glance became a wound as deep as any lash. In rare cases, prisoners were forced into cells with others, but this too carried its own cruelty. Companionship offered temporary relief, yet the stress of captivity turned even friends into enemies. Hunger sharpened suspicion. Disease made men shun one another. Whispered secrets could mean survival or betrayal. In some dungeons, captors deliberately rotated prisoners, separating companions just as bonds began to form, ensuring no comfort could ever grow. Thus, loneliness was not always the absence of people. It was the impossibility of trust. Isolation also served as a weapon of interrogation. Guards would remove a man from a crowded cell and cast him alone in the blackness for days. When he returned, he was often ready to confess anything, just for the sound of another voice. Chroniclers wrote of men who begged for torture rather than silence, because at least pain came with human presence. The idea of being forgotten, buried alive in obscurity, was more terrifying than the lash or the flame. The effects of solitude could be seen in the body as much as the mind. Prisoners stopped eating, stopped moving, let themselves waste away. Others grew frantic, pacing endlessly until their chains clattered, unable to rest. Some clawed at the walls until their nails split, desperate to carve a tunnel to nowhere. Guards often mocked them, calling them shadow men or the living dead, because once loneliness had devoured them, they were no longer truly human in the eyes of their captors. And yet, for a few, solitude produced strange resilience. Deprived of everything, they turned inward, finding strength in memory and prayer or in sheer defiance. Stories exist of captives who used silence as training, repeating whole epics in their minds so they would not forget language, or imagining elaborate feasts and battles as though building new worlds inside themselves. These were the rare ones, who emerged alive not only in body, but with a spark of soul still intact. But even they carried the scars of isolation, jittering at sudden noises, fearing the quiet, unable to sleep without voices nearby. The dungeon's silence was, in truth, a mirror. It reflected back the prisoner's fears, regrets, and weaknesses. Alone in the dark, a man was forced to face himself with no distraction. Guilt over past deeds, shame at capture, fear of death, all grew louder than any scream. The dungeon did not need guards to torment the captives. Often the prisoner's own mind became his most ruthless executioner. But just as loneliness pressed upon the mind, it opened the door to a deeper cruelty, hope that flickered and died again and again. A prisoner could survive the silence if he believed rescue was coming, if he clung to the idea of footsteps outside his cell that belonged to a friend. Yet when no rescue arrived, when footsteps belonged only to guards bringing chains or rotten bread, hope itself became poison. Waiting for salvation that never came twisted loneliness into despair until even the thought of freedom was unbearable. And so, in the suffocating darkness with no one to hear their cries and no one to remember their names, prisoners discovered that isolation was not the absence of life, but the erasure of it. It was a slow fading, like a candle burning out in an empty hall, leaving only darkness behind. As their minds unraveled and their souls trembled, a deeper horror awaited, because the dungeon was not content with silence alone. Beyond loneliness lay humiliation, the deliberate stripping of pride and honor, a final cruelty that reduced prisoners not just to captives, but to spectacles of shame. Humiliation was a weapon more refined than chains or whips. If hunger tore the flesh and disease rotted the body, shame dismantled what was left of a prisoner's humanity. In the medieval world, honor was not just personal pride, it was the very foundation of identity. A knight's worth lay in his reputation, a peasant's dignity in his resilience, a noble's power in the respect he commanded. To strip that away was to kill without spilling blood, to make a man walk the earth as a hollowed figure who no longer recognized himself. The degradation often began inside the dungeon itself. Prisoners were denied clothes, left in rags that barely covered their bodies, forced to sit in their filth, while guards mocked their stench. Knights who once wore polished armor found themselves crawling naked across cold stones, their nobility erased with every jeer. Guards spat insults, compared them to dogs, sometimes making them bark or crawl on all fours as a form of twisted entertainment. In that world, the body became a theater of ridicule, and the prisoner the unwilling actor in a play of cruelty. Some punishments were staged deliberately for others to witness. Captives were paraded through castle courtyards or town squares, shackled and beaten in front of crowds. The humiliation was not only for the prisoner, but for his family, his comrades, his entire community. When a captured knight was dragged through the mud while peasants laughed, the message was clear. No armor, no oath, no lineage could save him now. Chroniclers write of noblemen weeping not under torture, but under the gaze of those who once respected them. Public humiliation was as much a weapon of propaganda as it was a form of punishment. One of the cruelest methods of shaming was the pillory or the stocks. Prisoners were locked in wooden frames in busy squares, their heads and hands immobilized while passers-by spat on them, threw rotten food, or mocked their misery. Sometimes the punishment lasted hours, sometimes days, leaving men sunburned, frozen, or soaked by rain, while the humiliation gnawed at their souls. Unlike torture in the dungeon, which remained hidden, this humiliation was on display, turning the captive into a warning and a spectacle. Even within the prison walls, humiliation became routine. Guards forced prisoners to fight each other for scraps of bread, laughing as hunger drove them to tear at one another. Some captives were made to sing or dance while chained, mocked for their weakness, their trembling bodies a form of grotesque entertainment. Others were branded with hot irons, not for execution, but to mark them forever as traitors, cowards, or thieves. These scars carried humiliation beyond the dungeon, following survivors even into freedom. The psychological cruelty of humiliation was devastating. A man might withstand pain, hunger, or isolation if he could cling to pride, to the idea that he remained honorable even in defeat. But when stripped naked, mocked, or paraded like an animal, that last refuge collapsed. Shame infected the spirit more deeply than disease infected the flesh. It was not unusual for prisoners to refuse food after such degradation, or to beg for death, rather than endure another day of mockery. What made humiliation particularly cruel was its permanence. Wounds could heal, hunger could fade, but honor once shattered was almost impossible to restore. A knight ransomed back to his family after years of captivity might return scarred and weak, but worse, he returned disgraced. Whispers followed him. He had been made to crawl, he had been spat on, he had been broken. In a society where legacy was everything, humiliation was a fate worse than death, and humiliation was not confined to the body or reputation, it extended to the soul. Some prisoners were denied the right to pray, their religious objects mocked or desecrated before their eyes. For a deeply faithful medieval man, being denied connection to God was the ultimate form of degradation. Captors sometimes forced men to blaspheme under threat of beating, or laughed as priests were stripped of vestments and made to beg like common criminals. To strip a man of his faith was to leave him not only dishonored, but spiritually abandoned. Yet humiliation was not just inflicted by guards or crowds. It seeped into the very relationships between prisoners. The desperation of survival drove men to betray one another, to steal, to lie, to crawl lower than they ever imagined possible. In those moments, humiliation became self-inflicted. Men despised themselves for what hunger or fear had made them do, and that shame lingered long after the bruises faded. Still, as cruel as humiliation was, it was often paired with something even more unbearable, the physical reminder of captivity that could never be escaped. Because while humiliation shredded pride, the weight of iron itself, chains, shackles, and bonds that never loosened, became a punishment that lasted every waking moment, carving its own scars into the body and the spirit. Chains were not simply tools of restraint in the medieval dungeon. They were instruments of slow destruction, grinding against flesh and spirit day after day, until the prisoner no longer remembered what it felt like to move freely. The moment the irons were fastened, a man's body became property of the dungeon. Shackles clamped at the ankles and wrists were more than barriers to escape. They were declarations of ownership, cold metal signatures that said, "You belong to us now." The weight of chains was constant. Even when a prisoner slept, the iron was there, pressing into bone, cutting into skin. Many awoke in the night with wrists rubbed raw, the skin blistered and bleeding where the shackles dug deepest. The ankles bore purple scars, layers of tissue torn away until iron met bone. Infections set in easily, and men hobbled through their days with wounds that never healed. But there was no removing the irons, no relief. Guards checked them constantly, tightening the locks, making sure every prisoner remained tethered like livestock. Some chains were attached to the walls, forcing men to stand for hours, unable to sit or rest. Others were short enough to make lying down impossible, so prisoners slept upright, their necks bent at grotesque angles. The cruelty of the design was intentional. Chains were not merely to keep men in place. They were to remind them with every movement that freedom no longer existed. A simple action, like stretching an arm or shifting weight, became impossible. The body learned to live in small movements, and in time, the prisoner forgot the sensation of walking without dragging iron behind him. There was also sound. Chains had a voice of their own. The clank of iron against stone, the rattle of links with every shuffle, the grinding noise that echoed endlessly in the dungeon corridors. For some prisoners, this sound became unbearable, a constant reminder that they were never free, even in their dreams. For others, it was the sound of identity itself. No longer a knight, no longer a farmer, no longer a free man, but a captive defined only by the iron that bound him. The dungeon spoke through the chains, and its language was despair. The psychological weight was often worse than the physical. Men began to measure their existence not in days or meals, but in the bruises left by shackles. They learned to move carefully, to lean against the wall in just the right way to relieve the pressure, to shift their weight to avoid tearing open old wounds. Life became a negotiation with iron, and losing that negotiation meant agony. Some prisoners broke down completely, sobbing as they begged guards to loosen their chains by just an inch. Others grew numb, staring at their shackles as though they were an extension of their own flesh. But not all chains were static. Some prisoners were forced to drag long, heavy lengths of iron wherever they went. These dragging chains carved grooves into the stone floors of castles, visible even centuries later, silent testimonies to the suffering of countless men. Guards laughed at the sight of prisoners tripping over their own bonds, the iron wrapping around their legs and sending them crashing face first onto the ground. Even drinking or eating became humiliating tasks, performed with trembling hands shackled together, the prisoner fumbling like a child in front of sneering captors. The iron also became a tool of spectacle. In some cases, chains were deliberately oversized, far heavier than necessary to display the power of the captor. Prisoners were paraded through courtyards, their massive shackles making them stumble while crowds jeered. Nobles taken in war were sometimes adorned with chains plated in gold or silver, mocking symbols that turned their bondage into theater. The message was clear. Their pride was as bound as their bodies. Yet, as oppressive as chains were, they also carried a darker function. They weakened the body to make it easier prey for further punishment. Shackled men could not defend themselves against blows, could not resist when dragged to torture chambers. Their muscles atrophied, their bones stiffened, and when they were unchained even briefly, many collapsed from weakness, unable to remember how to walk. The chains did not just confine, they conditioned, breaking the body in preparation for greater torments. Some prisoners attempted to rebel against the iron. They tried to pick the locks with scraps of wood or bone, rubbed the shackles against stone in secret attempts to wear them down. Legends tell of men filing links for months with hidden nails, only to be discovered and punished with heavier chains than before. In truth, very few ever escaped. The iron was too strong, the guards too vigilant, and the prisoner's body too frail. The rebellion usually ended in despair, and the chains tightened once more. Still, the most terrifying aspect of chains was not their weight or their pain, but their permanence. A whip's lash ended, a guard's mockery faded, but the iron remained. Day after day, month after month, year after year, it clung to the body until the prisoner could no longer imagine life without it. Even those few who were eventually freed sometimes carried phantom sensations of shackles on their skin, their wrists aching at night as though the chains had never been removed. Freedom after bondage was not freedom at all. It was another kind of captivity carried inside the mind. And in this endless struggle against iron, prisoners discovered that even the smallest sound or movement could become unbearable, because beyond the rattle of chains and the bruises on flesh, another terror lurked in the dungeon. It was not inflicted by guards, nor forged in iron. It came from the voices of others, the screams of torture that seeped through the walls, turning silence into horror. Sound was never absent in a medieval dungeon. Silence existed only in fragments, brief intervals before another cry shattered it, or the metallic clang of chains echoed against the stone. For the prisoner, the dungeon was not just a place of darkness, it was a theater of sound, each noise loaded with meaning, each echo a reminder of suffering. The body might grow numb to hunger or chains, but the ear never closed. It absorbed everything, day and night, until the prisoner's sanity began to unravel beneath the weight of the noises around him. The most haunting sound of all was the human scream. It pierced through the walls, raw and primal, carrying pain that no language could disguise. A prisoner would sit in his cell, holding his breath, as somewhere down the corridor another man shrieked under the whip or the fire. The scream would rise, break into sobs, and sometimes fall silent too quickly, leaving the listener to wonder if death had claimed the voice. Other times it dragged on endlessly, a high, broken wail that stretched for hours, echoing in the skull until even sleep became impossible. The cruelty was doubled by anticipation, because every scream was a prophecy. If it was happening to another, it could, and eventually would, happen to you. But the screams were not alone. There were the sounds of iron tools clattering, the hiss of torches heating brands, the rhythmic strikes of wooden mallets driving wedges into joints. These sounds became recognizable to the experienced prisoner. He knew the difference between the crack of a whip and the crunch of bone. He could distinguish the dragging of chains from the scraping of a rack being prepared. The dungeon trained its captives to become unwilling interpreters of pain, mapping every noise to a form of suffering. And knowledge, far from comforting, made the terror worse. Sometimes the sounds came closer. A prisoner might hear footsteps approaching his door, the heavy boots of guards, the rattle of keys, the scrape of hinges. Even if they passed by, the dread lingered, because the next time, it might stop at his cell. That uncertainty gnawed more cruelly than hunger. Many men confessed to crimes they had not committed simply because footsteps paused too long outside their door. The dungeon was not just stone and iron. It was sound used as weapon, orchestrated by the captors with merciless precision. And then there were the small sounds, no less tormenting. The endless dripping of water from the ceiling, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made time unbearable. The scurrying of rats in the straw, their claws scratching against stone. The wheeze of a cellmate struggling for breath, each exhale weaker than the last. These sounds filled the void between screams, never letting the prisoner forget where he was. Even silence, when it came, was not relief. It was a trap. Because silence meant waiting, and waiting always ended with sound returning, louder than before. Some prisoners tried to block it out. They stuffed straw in their ears or pressed their hands to their heads until their nails broke skin. Others turned the noise into a kind of twisted ritual, counting drips or matching their breathing to the screams, as if control could be found in rhythm. But nothing truly silenced the dungeon. Even in dreams, the echoes returned. Prisoners woke screaming themselves, not from pain, but from the memory of sounds they could not escape. The guards knew how powerful sound could be. They exaggerated it, dragging chains slowly along the stones just to make prisoners flinch. They banged on doors without reason, jolting captives from fragile moments of rest. Sometimes they staged false tortures, whipping empty air while others screamed on command, creating terror without even touching the victims. For the dungeon keepers, sound was not background, it was strategy. What made the soundscape truly unbearable was its lack of resolution. A scream began, but a prisoner never knew how it ended. Was the man dead? Was he still alive, broken and silent? That uncertainty corroded the mind. It was not the certainty of death that destroyed, but the endless guessing, the imagination filling in horrors worse than reality. In this way, every sound was both information and torture, both truth and weaponized fear. Even nature had its voice inside the dungeon. In winter, the wind howled through cracks, carrying distant noises that prisoners mistook for voices of the dead. In storms, thunder rumbled through the earth, shaking walls and reminding captives of a world they no longer touched. Some believed they heard angels, others demons, as their minds tried desperately to make sense of the endless barrage of noise. Reality and imagination blurred until one was indistinguishable from the other. For those who survived long enough, the worst came after release. Many carried the dungeon's sounds with them for life. A dripping roof in a peasant's hut brought back memories of water falling in the cell. The squeal of iron gates in villages echoed the dungeon doors. The cry of an animal in pain could send a freed man into a panic, convinced he had been dragged back to the place of torment. The dungeon was not left behind. It followed in echoes, carved into memory forever. But within the dungeon itself, sound was only one layer of horror. The noises primed the body with dread, weakened the mind with anticipation. And once the captive was sufficiently broken, the guards introduced the next cruelty, one that fused humiliation with pain, turning the prisoner into a living spectacle. Because the dungeon was not satisfied with breaking men in private, it sought to expose their degradation to the eyes of others, ensuring their shame lasted longer than their screams. The dungeon was never just a cage, it was a stage. Captivity alone was not enough to satisfy the cruelty of the medieval world. What truly broke a prisoner was not only what happened in the darkness, but what was forced upon him under the eyes of others. Humiliation became theater, and the prisoner, the unwilling actor in a performance designed to degrade him completely. Every gesture, every punishment, every display of suffering was a message, to the captive, to the people watching, and to anyone who dared to oppose the hand of power. Public spectacle often began with parades of shame. Prisoners were dragged from their cells and marched through the streets in chains, their clothes torn or stripped entirely, their faces swollen from beatings. The crowd jeered, spat, and hurled refuse at them, children mocking them with the same cruelty as soldiers. Knights who once rode proudly on war horses were forced to stumble barefoot through mud, tugged along by ropes tied around their necks. To the common folk, it was entertainment. To rulers, it was propaganda. The display screamed a simple truth. If this could happen to the strong, what chance did the weak ever have? In many towns, the pillory and the stocks became central instruments of spectacle. These wooden frames, placed in busy squares, immobilized a man by locking his head and hands or feet into position. There he stood, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, exposed to the ridicule of all who passed. Rotten vegetables, mud, even human waste were thrown at his face. Guards encouraged the public to spit insults, and laughter echoed as the prisoner swayed in exhaustion, his dignity peeling away one layer at a time. The punishment was not designed to kill. It was designed to leave a scar far deeper than flesh, one that followed the prisoner into memory and reputation. But humiliation did not always require crowds. Even within the dungeon walls, prisoners were often forced to perform degrading tasks. Some were made to clean filth with bare hands, scrubbing the waste of others while guards watched with mocking grins. Others were ordered to sing or dance while shackled, their trembling limbs turning their misery into grotesque entertainment. Nobles were made to serve food to peasants or bow before their captors, a reversal of social order that cut to the bone. For a medieval man, whose worth was measured by honor, such acts were worse than pain. They were the stripping away of identity itself. Some humiliations were deliberately permanent. Branding was one such cruelty. Hot irons seared symbols into the skin of prisoners, marking them forever as traitors, heretics, or criminals. Even if ransomed or released, the mark declared their shame to the world. A knight branded on the forehead could never escape whispers. A thief branded on the hand carried his humiliation to every marketplace. The body became a lifelong proclamation of disgrace, visible proof of the power the dungeon once held over him. In other cases, the spectacle blurred the line between punishment and execution. Prisoners were dragged to scaffolds, beaten in front of crowds but spared at the last moment, only to be returned to their cells. This cycle was repeated to keep fear alive, to make death itself into a performance that never quite concluded. Chroniclers describe prisoners fainting in terror as nooses were tightened around their necks, only for the rope to be loosened at the last moment. The guards laughed, the crowd cheered, and the prisoner collapsed in despair, knowing he would face it all again. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of public humiliation was its reach beyond the prison walls. For the captive, suffering in the dungeon was private, endured in the shadows, but humiliation in front of others was carried outward, infecting his family, his comrades, his lineage. A knight paraded in chains stained not only his name but the banners of his house. A priest mocked before a crowd tainted the faith he represented. Humiliation spread like a disease, reminding entire communities that resistance meant degradation, and degradation meant eternal shame. This weapon was so effective that rulers often preferred humiliation to execution. Death silenced an enemy, but shame silenced many more. To live on as a broken man, mocked in whispers, avoided by friends, distrusted by allies, this was a punishment that reached further than any sword. Many prisoners begged for death rather than endure public spectacle again, yet the dungeon rarely granted such mercy. And humiliation was never the final step. It was part of a sequence, each cruelty building on the last. A man beaten in private was then mocked in public. A man chained was then paraded. A man branded was then left to rot in his cell, his humiliation echoing long after the jeers faded. The dungeon was a machine of suffering, and humiliation was one of its sharpest gears. But as devastating as the laughter and mockery were, the body itself still bore the deepest testimony of captivity. Because while humiliation shredded the spirit, the relentless pressure of chains and iron left wounds that could never be hidden. The prisoner carried them not only during captivity, but often for life. And when chains weakened the body to its core, another silent force crept in, one that could not be laughed away or mocked in public: the slow, inevitable march of disease. The scars of captivity were not confined to the soul. They were etched into the flesh of every prisoner who endured the medieval dungeon. Shackles, whips, filth, and neglect left the body marked in ways that never faded. Even those who survived to see freedom again carried their cells with them, written across their skin and buried deep in their bones. A dungeon did not merely cage men. It transformed them into living testimonies of suffering, their bodies reminders of what it meant to be broken slowly over time. The iron left its signature first, shackles tightened around wrists and ankles until the skin tore open. The wounds rarely had time to heal because the chains never came off. Over weeks, metal rubbed against raw flesh, cutting deeper until ulcers formed. Infections spread easily, turning simple abrasions into festering sores. Prisoners often limped, their ankles swollen and purple, the skin permanently gouged by iron. Even years after release, men bore dark bands of scar tissue where chains had once bitten. For some, the bones themselves deformed under the constant pressure, leaving them twisted and crippled. Whip marks ran across backs and legs like grotesque patterns. Each lashing added a new layer of scar tissue until the skin resembled cracked leather. Some wounds never closed properly in the filth of the dungeon. Flies laid eggs in open gashes. Maggots burrowed under the skin. These were not exaggerations of cruelty, but documented realities of medieval confinement. To live with such wounds meant living with constant pain, each movement reopening what could not heal. A man did not need to be executed to be destroyed. His own body became his executioner, tearing itself apart day by day. Disease deepened the destruction. Malnutrition made bones brittle. Teeth rotted and fell, gums bled until even the act of chewing was agony. Scurvy swelled joints and blackened skin, leaving prisoners unable to walk. Dysentery wasted men away into shadows of themselves, their bodies trembling from dehydration. Respiratory illnesses consumed others. Tuberculosis hollowed the chest, leaving coughing fits that sprayed blood across the straw. And once disease spread in the close quarters of a dungeon, it was unstoppable. A single sick man could infect an entire row of cells in days. What made these afflictions even crueler was the total lack of care. A knight wounded on the battlefield could expect his comrades to bind his injuries, his lord to summon a healer. A prisoner had no such hope. Guards laughed at pleas for bandages. Rotting wounds were left to spread until the stench became unbearable even to those who carried it. Some prisoners begged their captors to cut off limbs consumed by gangrene, but mercy was rarely granted. Instead, they were left to watch their own flesh die slowly, while their cellmates prayed the infection would not leap to them next. But not all scars were visible. Hunger left its own invisible legacy. Bodies shrank, muscles withered, and bellies swelled grotesquely from starvation. Survivors of long captivity often remained permanently frail, their stomachs unable to hold full meals even after release. They trembled from weakness, their hands shaking from the damage of years without nourishment. Malnutrition stunted growth in younger captives, leaving them physically marked as much as spiritually scarred. Then there were the injuries inflicted, as punishment or experimentation. Dislocated shoulders from being hung by the wrists, broken fingers crushed under mallets, joints stretched on racks until they snapped. Some captives were blinded deliberately, their eyes gouged or burned, so they would return to their homes as warnings. Others had ears or noses cut away, physical mutilations that ensured humiliation would follow them beyond the dungeon. These scars were not accidents, they were crafted intentionally to make the body itself a message. The psychological effect of these physical scars was devastating. A prisoner released with a limp, a missing hand, or a branded forehead did not return as the man who had once been captured. He returned as a marked reminder of his captor's power. Communities saw the wounds before they heard the stories, and those marks carried weight. Families wept not only for what was endured, but for what could never be undone. Children recoiled from fathers who had come back as strangers. Wives held men who no longer looked like themselves. The dungeon had succeeded in creating living ghosts, yet despite this devastation, the most enduring scar was not on the skin, but in the memory of every survivor. Because behind every whip mark, every infected wound, every broken bone was the knowledge that it had all been intentional. The body had been made into an object of cruelty, not by chance, but by design. That knowledge poisoned even moments of freedom because the prisoner understood that his scars were not accidents of war. They were the trophies of his captor's power. And still, there was one force that proved even more destructive than iron or whip, one that killed more surely than hunger or disease, because while scars were carried on the body, the mind carried its own wounds. Memories replayed endlessly, shame corroded the spirit, and nightmares kept men bound long after chains were gone. The dungeon had not only sought to destroy the flesh, it had aimed for the soul. And for many prisoners, the true captivity began only after release, in the endless war against their own haunted minds. The deepest wounds of the dungeon were not carved into the flesh, but into the mind. Long after the chains were removed, long after the sores healed and the scars closed, prisoners carried the invisible weight of captivity within them. The dungeon lived on inside their thoughts, in the quiet spaces of memory, in the sleepless nights when screams returned unbidden. It was said that a man could leave the cell, but the cell never truly left the man. The first and most relentless scar was fear. Prisoners lived in constant dread, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside their door, waiting for the next lash, the next brand, the next humiliation. That fear did not vanish with freedom. Men who had been released often flinched at the creak of doors in their homes, at the rattle of chains on carts in the marketplace, at the cry of an animal that too closely resembled a man in pain. The dungeon trained them to expect cruelty in every sound, and so the world outside became another prison, filled with reminders of the horrors they had endured. Night was the cruelest time. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it carried nightmares. Former prisoners dreamed of walls closing in, of rats crawling across their skin, of guards laughing as whips cracked in the dark. They woke drenched in sweat, clawing at their own wrists as if the shackles were still there. Some muttered prayers in the night. Others screamed until families shook them awake. These terrors did not fade with years. They grew stronger, because the mind replayed captivity like a wound that refused to close. Guilt was another torment. Many prisoners confessed to crimes they never committed, betrayed comrades, or abandoned hope simply to survive. When they emerged, they carried shame heavier than chains. They wondered if their families despised them for what they had said under torture, or if their comrades cursed their names for words spoken in desperation. Some were haunted by the memory of cellmates they could not save, of friends who died beside them while they lived on. Survival itself became a source of pain because to live meant to carry the memory of those who had not. The dungeon also stripped away trust. In captivity, betrayal was common. A prisoner might reveal secrets to gain an extra crust of bread, or guards might turn men against each other with lies. That poison lingered after release. Survivors struggled to trust neighbors, comrades, even family. They saw betrayal in every gesture, lies in every word. Many became reclusive, withdrawing from the very communities they once fought to protect. In this way, the dungeon succeeded not only in tormenting individuals, but in fracturing entire societies. For some, the scars of the mind took the form of madness. Isolation, deprivation, and terror blurred the line between reality and hallucination. Prisoners who once spoke with clarity returned home muttering to themselves, responding to voices no one else could hear. Chroniclers describe men who spent their days scratching invisible walls, convinced they were still in the cell. Others sat in silence, eyes fixed on nothing, their spirits so hollowed that even freedom could not rouse them. These were not isolated cases, but the natural consequence of months or years under the psychological weight of captivity. Faith, too, was shaken. Some prisoners clung to prayer as their only lifeline, whispering psalms into the darkness, but others found their faith broken. They wondered why God had abandoned them, why no miracle delivered them from chains. Priests captured in war were forced to blaspheme or watch holy symbols desecrated. For these men, release brought not comfort, but spiritual emptiness, the loss of the one anchor that might have carried them through. In a world where religion was the bedrock of identity, such loss was devastating. And yet, amid the despair, some prisoners carried out acts of quiet resistance in their minds. They created elaborate fantasies, entire worlds built within memory, where they feasted on imaginary banquets or fought glorious battles that never happened. These mental escapes were the only way to preserve a sense of self, but even those who survived through imagination often found that the lines blurred. The imagined worlds became more vivid than reality, and the return to ordinary life felt dull, alien, unbearable. Reality could not compete with the desperate visions that had once kept them alive. The trauma of captivity stretched into the future as well. Children of former prisoners grew up hearing fragmented stories, watching fathers who trembled at noises, mothers who wept at night, relatives who recoiled from crowds. The dungeon did not end with the captive. It seeped into families, shaping generations. Fear and silence became inherited burdens. Scars passed down not through chains, but through memory and behavior. But the most haunting truth was this: the dungeon was designed to create these invisible scars. Its architects understood that killing a man silenced him, but breaking his spirit allowed him to carry the message outward. Survivors walked into the world as living warnings, reminders of the power of the dungeon, proof that even freedom could not erase captivity. In this way, the dungeon's reach extended far beyond its walls, stretching into villages, courts, and battlefields, wherever the broken survivors carried their pain. And yet, as much as the mind could be scarred, there were still rare sparks of resilience. Some prisoners, though haunted, managed to rebuild, to transform their pain into testimony, to warn others or inspire resistance. But even these rare survivors could never erase the dungeon entirely. It lingered in their pauses, in their nightmares, in their gaze. The dungeon was not just a place they had been, it was a place they carried, a prison inside their very souls. And while these psychological scars ensured that many never truly escaped, there was still another cruelty waiting in the dungeon's arsenal: the betrayal of hope. Because after months or years of torment, the promise of ransom or rescue often proved nothing more than a lie. And the realization that freedom might never come was, for many, the final and most devastating blow. Hope was the most dangerous currency in a medieval dungeon. It was dangled like a piece of meat before starving men, keeping them alive just long enough to suffer another day. For many prisoners, the belief that ransom or negotiation would bring freedom was the only thread holding them to life. Yet, in most cases, that thread was cut, not by the captor's cruelty alone, but by betrayal, broken promises, and the slow realization that no one was coming. At first, hope often came in whispers. A guard would mention that negotiations had begun. A fellow prisoner would swear he heard rumors of a ransom being raised. Families wrote letters, smuggled through the hands of intermediaries, assuring the captive that money was being gathered, that men were working tirelessly for his release. These words lit a spark inside the prisoner. He began counting the days again, imagining the moment the cell door would open, picturing himself stepping into the sunlight. He replayed memories of home, of family, of comrades waiting for his return. For a time, hope gave him strength to endure the hunger, the chains, the screams. But hope was also a weapon. Guards exploited it deliberately, feeding prisoners lies to keep them docile. They promised release soon, only to drag the days into weeks. Some captors demanded impossible ransoms, some so high they knew families could never pay, all while letting the prisoner believe freedom was just beyond reach. In this way, hope became another form of torture, more effective than the whip, because it stretched suffering indefinitely. A man who believes he will be freed tomorrow can endure almost anything today. But when tomorrow comes, and the chains remain, despair multiplies. Betrayal often cut deeper than chains. Many prisoners came to realize that their lords, their comrades, even their families had abandoned them. A knight who expected his ransom to be a matter of honor discovered his lord considered him expendable. A peasant soldier captured in war might wait for kin who simply had no means to pay. Some families did not dare bankrupt themselves for one life when survival of the household depended on holding back their last coins. For the prisoner, the realization was devastating. He had marched into war, believing in loyalty, but captivity revealed the truth. In the ledger of power, some lives were worth less than others. There are chronicles of noblemen who cursed their own bloodlines from their cells, swearing that if they ever escaped, they would exact vengeance not on their captors, but on their kin. Others broke completely, begging their captors to kill them rather than leave them in limbo. A man could withstand hunger or pain if he believed someone was fighting for him, but once he knew he had been forgotten, the will to live collapsed. Even when negotiations were genuine, the process was painfully slow. Messengers rode for weeks, gold was counted coin by coin, agreements drafted and disputed. Meanwhile, the prisoner rotted. Imagine waiting in a cell, coughing blood, starving, listening to screams, while across kingdoms men debated whether you were worth 20 silver coins or 30. To the captive, every delay was another lash. By the time some ransoms were finally paid, the prisoner had already died, leaving his captors richer and his family poorer with nothing to show but regret. Worse still were the cases of deception. Some captors accepted ransom and then refused to release the prisoner, keeping both the gold and the man. Others staged false releases, bringing prisoners to the edge of freedom only to drag them back, laughing at their broken expressions. In such moments, hope did not just die, it turned poisonous. The prisoner learned that even the promise of freedom was a trap, another trick to prolong his agony. This betrayal corroded every bond of trust. Men stopped believing in letters, in rumors and promises whispered by fellow captives. They stopped looking up when footsteps approached, stopped hoping the creak of the dungeon door meant release. They sat in silence, eyes vacant, souls extinguished. Hope once kept them alive, now it killed them, because every spark rekindled only to be extinguished again was more unbearable than despair itself. And yet, some prisoners clung to false hope, even as it betrayed them. They carved their family names into the stone, rehearsed the words they would say when reunited with their children, imagined walking through the gates of their villages with chains falling from their wrists. For these men, hope became less a belief in rescue and more a desperate fantasy, a shield against the unbearable truth. But fantasy could only last so long. When their bodies failed and their minds cracked, even dreams abandoned them. Hope's betrayal was the final cruelty of the dungeon. Hunger stripped the flesh, chains scarred the skin, torture broke the bones, but false hope broke the soul. A man who no longer believed in rescue was already half dead, and his captors knew it. That was why they wielded hope with such precision, not to comfort, but to prolong torment, to keep the captive alive long enough to suffer more. And still, there was one cruelty that loomed darker than betrayal, one that crushed even those who still clung to scraps of faith. Because if waiting, humiliation, and lies could not finish the work, the dungeon had another weapon, the slow erasure of identity itself until the prisoner no longer remembered who he had been. The final cruelty of the dungeon was not hunger, disease, or even the lash. It was the slow erasure of identity. A man might endure chains and pain if he still remembered who he was, if he could cling to his name, his rank, his family, his place in the world. But the dungeon was built to strip that away, to grind him down until he became not a knight, not a farmer, not a father or son, but merely a shadow, a body without memory, a nameless creature in the dark. It began subtly with the loss of titles. Nobles accustomed to hearing themselves addressed as lord or sir suddenly found guards calling them dog, worm, or meat. Their lineage, their banners, their histories meant nothing within those walls. They were not prisoners of rank, they were simply captives. The same reduction happened to peasants and soldiers. A man who once plowed fields or fought with comrades now had no labor, no comrades, no purpose. In the dungeon, everyone was leveled to the same ground, faceless figures chained to stone. Clothing was another weapon in the erasure of identity. Prisoners were stripped of garments that marked their station, armor, robes, even simple tunics. Rags were issued in their place, if anything at all. Men who once stood proudly in silks or battle-worn leather found themselves naked in filth, indistinguishable from the man rotting in the next cell. The uniform of captivity was degradation, and in time, even prisoners stopped seeing themselves as individuals. They were not lords or farmers anymore. They were bodies, half-starved, half-mad, draped in the same stinking tatters. Names were stolen next. Guards referred to prisoners by numbers, by insults, or by the crimes they were accused of. Some captives went years without hearing their true names spoken aloud. In that silence, names began to fade from memory like ink washed from parchment. Prisoners muttered their own names under their breath, terrified of forgetting, repeating them as prayers. I am Thomas, son of Geoffrey. I am Sir William of York. I am Robert of no land, but still alive. But with time, even that repetition lost meaning. Men forgot their surnames, then their fathers' names, then eventually even their given names. They became nothing but prisoner, their past erased as if it had never existed. Language itself began to disintegrate. Isolated, deprived of conversation, prisoners lost the rhythm of speech. Their words grew slurred, their vocabularies shrank, their voices cracked from disuse. Chroniclers describe men who, after years in darkness, could no longer form sentences when finally freed. They stammered, spoke in fragments, or fell silent altogether. The dungeon had taken not only their identities, but their very ability to communicate, the most human trait of all. Memory faltered too. Without markers of time, without the daily rituals of normal life, the mind struggled to hold on to the past. Birthdays, seasons, the faces of wives and children, all blurred into shadow. Some prisoners conjured false memories, convinced they had seen people or places that never existed. Others began to doubt their own pasts entirely. Did they truly fight in that battle? Did they really have a wife waiting at home, or had it all been a dream? Identity unraveled, thread by thread, until nothing remained but uncertainty. The dungeon walls themselves reinforced this erasure. They were covered with scratches, carvings, desperate attempts by captives to leave proof of their existence. Names, prayers, crude drawings, marks etched into stone so that someone, someday, might remember them. But the irony was cruel. As the walls filled with graffiti, each prisoner became one more anonymous hand in the chorus of the forgotten. The carvings proved their existence, but also their erasure, because they were indistinguishable from the thousands who had come before. The most chilling effect of identity's destruction was that some prisoners embraced it. They stopped resisting, stopped repeating their names, stopped recalling their families. They surrendered to the dungeon's will, becoming compliant shadows who no longer dreamed of freedom. Guards called them ghosts. They shuffled in silence, obeyed without protest, ate without question, and waited for nothing. These men were not alive in spirit, only in body, their identities consumed entirely by captivity. For those who survived release, this loss of self was permanent. A freed man walked through his village as a stranger, unrecognized by his own kin. He looked into the faces of children who had grown while he rotted and felt nothing, because the man who had been their father no longer existed. Friends tried to speak of old battles, old hunts, old feasts, but the prisoner had no connection to those memories anymore. He had been erased, and no amount of freedom could restore him. The dungeon did not need to kill all its captives to succeed. It only needed to turn them into shadows, living reminders that captivity could erase everything a man was. In that way, the dungeon reached further than the grave. A man who died was mourned. A man who lived without identity was feared, pitied, and often forgotten anyway. And yet, there was one final step in this descent, one that lay beyond even the erasure of self. Because while some prisoners were left alive but hollow, others were taken to their ultimate end, a slow, anonymous death in the darkness, where their bodies were discarded like refuse and their names erased forever. The dungeon's greatest triumph was not breaking men while alive, it was ensuring they vanished from memory altogether. Death in the dungeon was not dramatic. It rarely came with a final battle cry or the strike of a sword. Instead, it slipped in quietly, like a shadow settling over the body, erasing one life at a time in a place where men had already been half forgotten. The dungeon was not designed to kill swiftly. It was designed to stretch suffering until death itself seemed like mercy, until a prisoner longed for it with the same hunger he once reserved for freedom. The end usually began in silence. A prisoner who once groaned in pain or muttered prayers fell quiet. His movements slowed, his eyes dulled, and his body slumped in the corner of the cell. Starvation or disease did not announce themselves with sudden strikes, but with steady erosion. One day he no longer reached for the crust of bread. Another day he no longer stirred when guards entered. Fellow captives learned to recognize the signs, and they often avoided looking at him, as though watching death approach might hasten their own. Sometimes death was quickened by fever. Men shivered violently in the dark, their bodies drenched with sweat despite the cold, eyes glassy with delirium. They spoke nonsense, called out for wives or mothers who would never come, clutched at the walls as though trying to walk home through the stone. When fever burned itself out, the prisoner collapsed, spent, and in the thick, infected air of the dungeon, few ever recovered. In other cases, it was hunger that won. Stomachs collapsed inward, ribs pressed hard against skin, and men became little more than skeletons wrapped in rags. Hunger drove some to madness before death, leading them to chew on straw, leather, or even the flesh of their own arms. Others simply wasted away, lying motionless for days before their breathing stopped. Death by hunger was the most prolonged of all, a battle against a void that could not be filled, and one of the dungeon's most common victories. When death came, it was rarely acknowledged. Guards dragged bodies away without ceremony, often leaving them for days to rot among the living before finally discarding them. In some prisons, corpses were hauled into pits outside castle walls, tossed among refuse, their names unrecorded. In others, bodies were left in shallow graves near the dungeon itself, so that the ground surrounding the castle became a silent cemetery of the forgotten. The dead were not mourned, they were disposed of. Their lives had ended in chains, and so they were treated as no more valuable than the iron that bound them. The horror was not only in dying, but in how anonymous death became. A knight captured in battle, once celebrated in song, might die nameless in the dungeon, his bones mingling with peasants and thieves. Families never received the bodies, never held burials, never spoke prayers over the remains. Letters begging for their return went unanswered. The man simply vanished, as though he had never lived at all. This erasure was the dungeon's final cruelty. It consumed not only the prisoner's life, but his memory, ensuring he was forgotten by the world he once belonged to. Some chroniclers note that prisoners tried to fight this oblivion by leaving marks, names carved into walls, prayers scratched into stone, crude drawings of families and homes. These inscriptions were desperate acts of defiance, proof that they had lived, that they had suffered, that they were more than shadows. But stone was merciless. Over time, guards defaced these carvings, or moss and damp swallowed them. The final message of a dying man dissolved into nothing, leaving no trace that he had ever resisted. The death of one prisoner was rarely the end of the story for those who shared the cell. Survivors were forced to sit beside the bodies, breathing the stench of decay, sleeping beside silent corpses until guards bothered to remove them. This was not neglect, it was another form of punishment. To live beside death was to be reminded constantly of one's own fate. Every corpse was a prophecy, whispering that the dungeon would not let any man leave unclaimed. Yet death also offered something the dungeon could not strip away: release. For many prisoners, death was not the enemy, but the escape. They welcomed it when it came, slipping into it like a final act of rebellion against chains and darkness. Their faces, in the rare accounts of witnesses, sometimes bore expressions of peace, as though they had finally reached a freedom no ransom could buy. In this sense, the dungeon could never fully triumph. It could torment, degrade, erase, but in the end, it could not stop death from liberating its captives. Still, for those left behind, that liberation was bittersweet. The dungeon consumed men so quietly that it was easy to forget that each death represented a life once filled with laughter, ambition, and love. And when the door finally opened for the rare prisoner who did survive, he carried with him not just his own scars, but the memory of countless others who never walked out. The ghosts of the dungeon lived on in every survivor, ensuring that the silence of death inside those walls would echo far beyond them. And so, the story of the medieval prisoner did not end with release or ransom, nor even with death itself. It ended in the legacy of suffering carried outward, in the warnings carved into stone in the haunted eyes of survivors, and in the chilling reminder that captivity was not just about chains, but about the erasure of everything that made a man human. The dungeon was never truly defeated, because those who survived carried it within them until their own final silence.